I like this popcorn trick. I think it's a good one. So we, our rule is it's kind of like popcorn, you know, when it's done, when like you have like a certain distance between the pops. And so
What's
letting
your rule? Because mine is 3 seconds. If there's 3 seconds between pops, it's done.
Mine is two.
Two.
I'm a bit more impatient.
Let's give them 2 more minutes.
Okay, I think we can start. Okay. Okay, so welcome back, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce our second speaker for today, so Professor Cassidy Sugimoto, who's from the School of Informatics, Computing and Engineering at Indiana University. She works on many different topics, but I think broadly speaking, we can say that she's interested in ways in which knowledge is produced, disseminated, and rewarded with, let's say, a particular focus on the issues of diversity and inclusion. And this last point is one of the reasons we're excited to have her this year as a faculty. So I apologize, Cassidy, if I misrepresent what you'll be talking about, but I don't expect this talk or this lecture to be about network science per se, but rather about how science is communicated nowadays. And as many participants of CNU are at their early stage of their scientific career, we believe that it's important that you come back from CNU not only with new friends and also new knowledge about techniques and methods used in network science, but also that you come back with a better understanding of the way we communicate science, of the many problems and shortcomings of the actual system, and most importantly, that you come back with some ideas or ways that you can be a part of the solution. So in a part of the solutions through the ways that you, through the choices that you will make when it comes to publication. So without further ado, I think now we say that the webcam is yours or the microphone is yours.
Fantastic. And that's an amazing introduction. And I feel like you should do my talk now because you do it better justice than perhaps I can. But as Antoine has mentioned, yes, I am not a network scientist, but I study science itself. So science is my object of inquiry and scientist. And so I do hope to make you think more reflexively about how you do science, the ways in which you're communicating and consuming science, also about the ways you are training and educating future scientists as mentors, and also a call to all of you, because I think the kinds of skills and tools that you have would be very helpful in answering some of these unanswered questions around science. And so I would love to urge you to come and bring all of your expertise to asking questions about science as well. So I have a lot of slides, and I do not intend that we get through all of them. I would rather that you interrupt me and we take this conversation in any way that it goes. So I'll stop at lots of little points and ask if there are any questions. I can't see the chat from my mode here, so I might rely on Juniper and Antoine to let me know if there's any questions going on in the chat, but feel free to jump in. So I'm going to focus really on the notion of science as being open and whether it is open or not. Thinking about for whom is science open? Who gets to do science? Who gets to be a scientist? Are scientific products open, both to read and to write? Is the evaluation system of science open? And then we're going to do a little one that's a bit peripheral, but I think fun and maybe interesting to many of the people here is science open to debate? And what kind of criticisms can we have in science? So I'm going to start sort of at the beginning. That is, who gets to come into science? Who gets to be a scientist? And by and large, I'm not going to introduce the data sets that we have used in too much detail because many of you may be familiar with them. But this is one data set that I think would be very interesting for some of you to look at if you are interested. So there are two complementary data sets that are hosted by the National Science Foundation, particularly the National Center of Science and Engineering and Statistics. And if any of you watch every 2 years, and now they actually have more frequent updates, they do the Science and Engineering Indicators. And it is sort of a global survey of where the nation sits in terms of the production of scientists and science, the investment in science from different sources. Two of these data sets are the Survey of Earned Doctorates and the Survey of Doctoral Recipients. And what this does, it really is an annual census of all individuals receiving a doctorate. So it is a survey, but unlike other surveys that have response rates maybe in the 40 or 60% if you're lucky, but often with internet surveys in 10%, the Survey of Earned Doctorates has almost 100% compliance, largely because it is roped into the requirements of graduation at many institutions. So you have your Survey of Earned Doctorates and the Survey of Doctoral Recipients, which is a bit of a longitudinal study. It's complicated in how they sort of replace participants, but it's been going on since 1973 to watch people go across their career. So we see who graduates and a lot of data about them. I mean, multitude of questions on them. Do they have children? Do they have a partner? What sector did they go to? Are they employed? What was their undergraduate degree, their graduate degree? Where were they born? What is their race and ethnicity? And so we have this wealth of information at the time they graduate and then at different sections across their career span. So it allows us to really look at careers unfolding within the US science system. Then we have the Web of Science, which I assume most of you are familiar with. So I won't go into that, but we use that for most of the data in this presentation. And so one of the things that I did while I was serving as a rotator at the National Science Foundation was match these two data sets, to take the Survey of Earned Doctorates and match it with the Web of Science, to look not only at who was graduating, but how the relationship of their bibliometric characteristics mapped onto their career trajectories. So let's just look at the distribution, and this may not surprise any of you, but if you look on men and women, you see that white men are overwhelmingly represented in the biological and agricultural sciences and engineering and the physical sciences, and to some degree in the social and psychological sciences. Those are just the big places where we graduate people. They're also overrepresented in the computational sciences. When we look at Asians, they skew towards engineering, computational, and math. And if we look at Hispanic and Black graduates, there are very, very few of them, and trending towards the biological and agricultural and engineering sciences for men, and barely present for women. In women, we see a very different mapping, tending much more towards the social sciences and psychological sciences, with Asian females going towards biological sciences, a little more towards social sciences, and again, a very small representation of Black and Hispanic graduates. And this is from 95 to 2006. Now, if we look at that Web of Science data, we did something very simple. We just saw whether they had a publication or not before they finished their PhD, and then what job they went into, and then whether within 6 years after their PhD they had a publication, and then where they ended up after that in terms of their career. And what we can see is a strong dominance of having a publication being a predictor of going into R&D in any way, whether they're going into academic R&D or corporate R&D, and then having another publication as being a determinant. And if you look up in that R&D academic, that second bubble at the end, it actually is a very small proportion of doctoral graduates that go into that sector. And R&D other is also a very small thing. So we have a lot of attrition that happens between graduating a doctorate and actually going into research careers. Very few people go into research careers, and those that do disproportionately have a publication before they graduate from their doctoral degree. But if we look at this across race and ethnicity, we see that there are very different propensities to publish before your PhD by race and ethnicity, with white males and females and Asian males and females, particularly in the biological and physical sciences, being much more likely to produce publications, where Hispanic and Black male and females produce less. Now, there are disciplinary differences in the social sciences. You're less likely to publish than in the physical sciences, but even within those, we see stark differences at the intersection of race and gender. Now, postdoctorate publications, we don't see it as much. It starts to blend out. Those who go into our academic R&D or non-academic R&D tend to actually publish at the same rate, suggesting that there is something fundamentally happening during doctoral training that's creating some of these disparities. And we can look at this again, throwing in all of those fantastic variables that we have from the Survey of Earned Doctorates and Survey of Doctoral Recipients, and it reinforces that same thing, that there is a significant difference in publishing for women versus men, and for Asian, Black, and Hispanic doctoral students versus white, and that those differences really start to disperse once we get to the postdoctorate publishing. So we looked at all of the different variables that led to publishing. What are the predictors of publishing? Now, some of them you can imagine. Being in an R1 research institution is going to make a difference. The field of study is going to make a difference. But what we found was the biggest predictor, and it's not too surprising, was whether you had a research assistantship as opposed to a teaching assistantship or a fellowship where you were fully funded but weren't engaged in lab research. And so we looked at how that fell across our Asian, Black, white, Hispanic, and male versus female candidates. And now if we just look at gender and race and the intersection there, Asians are disproportionately likely to have research assistantships compared to all other categories. But our Black, Hispanic, and female candidates were significantly less likely. When we include everything into the model, we reduce that gap, but we still see that same instance. So all things considering, the same field, the same institution, whether you're a first generation student or not, all of those kinds of variables that we can throw into the model, we still see that when we're giving out a research assistantship versus a teaching assistantship, we're going to privilege men over women, and we're going to privilege Asian and white candidates over our Black and Hispanic candidates. And that has huge things in creating a path dependencies towards being research active. So in that space, in that first moment when a doctoral student applies to a program, just in the terms of funding that you give them, you're creating a likelihood that that person is going to create a path towards being a productive scientist throughout their career. And what I love about these kinds of studies is how easily policy actionable they are, right? This is something that every institution can change. It's something that you can look at and say, how are we distributing our research assistantships? How are we distributing our fellowships? I think many institutions often think, oh, the best thing we can do to create a diverse cohort is to create these special fellowships. But in doing so, they often isolate those candidates outside of the research ecosystem, outside of the mentorship networks that would allow them to be successful in science generally. So moving on from that, let's say we get into the lab, you're in a team, you have that research assistantship. How does that change how you contribute to science? So in looking at this, we use a slightly different data source. Right now, any of you can go and look at a publication and see who's on the byline, right? Did you have a publication or not? But it doesn't tell you what people did to warrant authorship on that publication. So there are a growing number of journals that are collecting contributorship data, which doesn't just put you on, but says, who conceived and designed the experiment? Who performed the experiment? Who collected the data? Who funded the project? What did you do that warranted authorship? So the Public Library of Science, PLOS journals are one that have done this. Biomedical journals have been doing this for a long time, but many of the data aren't in a standardized form. They're embedded in a PDF. You have to sort of OCR them, clean them up. They're not really standard metadata, but places like PLOS are starting to do that. So we can use that and scrape that data to tell us a story about what people are doing. Now, when we first started this years ago, they were all idiosyncratic. People would just write it in an open text field. And so we had to clean and mine it down. And there were 5 main categories. You analyzed the data, you conceived and designed the experiments, you contributed materials, tools, you performed the experiments, or you wrote the paper. What I think is really fascinating is at that time, there were more than 20,000 other kinds of labor tasks that didn't fit into one of those, but only appear in about 20% of the papers. And so we see that there's this long tail of kinds of contributions to science that we're not grasping in this. And so the heterogeneity of scientific work is, I think, a really interesting and important thing. But we focused on those sort of 5 categories that appeared in most papers, and remembering that most of PLOS is actually geared towards the biomedical sciences. So one of the things that we looked at was which contributions were the most isolated. So if you were going to do 5 contributions or 4 contributions or 3, which ones were mostly likely to occur together? And what we found was performing the experimentation was the most likely to appear alone. Those who wrote the paper often did other things like conceiving and designing the experiments, but that experimentation was very isolated. Now, for us, that's a really interesting thing when we think about fraud and misconduct in science. If the people who are doing the experimentation are not the ones thinking of the project or writing up the results or even doing the analysis, we have a lot more potential for either error that is intentional or error that is unintentional in science. But when we took that and overlaid that on gender, we saw something really fascinating, that when we control for everything, age of the scientist, country, the collaborative team size, all of the variables that we could put into the analysis, women were significantly more likely to be performing experimentation, and men's authorship was significantly more likely to come from all the other categories. That is, women were doing the work of science, men were writing it up, doing the analysis. So there was a gendered nature to these kinds of contributions. Now, in the last 3-4 years, they have adopted a new taxonomy, the credit taxonomy, which is much more nuanced. It provides a lot more categories. So we've been able to go back and look at the data using these new categories. So here are the things for which men are more likely to be associated: supervising, providing funding and resources, thinking of things, providing software, doing the reviewing and editing, administrating, and doing some validation. Women are more likely to do the methodology, the visualization, the formal analysis, writing the whole paper, doing data curation, and the investigation. Those are pretty stark differences in what we think of as the labor contribution. So in some of the data that I'll show later on, which shows the disparity between men and women, we have to recognize that being an author does not mean equal kinds of labor. It's a not equal contribution to the work. And what we're seeing here is in many ways, women are doing the work of science, being the hands of science, but are often relegated to less dominant roles because they're not the supervisor, the advisor, the resource provider. Now, one of the things we wanted to look at relative to our work that we did in our doctoral careers and trajectories was, does this matter? Perhaps it is women as junior scholars going in, and this is a role that one must merely play, right? You must be the experimenter and the data collector in order to someday be the supervisor. So we tried to take all of these and we used sort of a Bayesian modeling technique to say, what happens when you start in certain roles? What is the likelihood that you go on to assume different roles over time? So we took those first categories and a bunch of metadata on the author from Web of Science, and we looked at about 350,000 distinct authors. And so we looked at the probability over a junior career, when they're sort of doctoral students, their early career as they're in their faculty, mid-career, and full career. And you can see changes in the kinds of performances. You're more likely to be writing the manuscript at different stages in your career, conceiving the experiment. So we see that there are these distinctions that happen as you age. So the younger people are more likely to perform experiments, whereas the older people are more likely to write the manuscript, for example. But if we take all of that and do an archetypal analysis, we can find that they're sort of leaders, people who end up doing a lot of these different things, those who are isolated or specialized, and those that are just sort of contributing and doing these minor tasks over their career. And if we look at it, if one is serving as a leader early in their career, you're far more likely to stay on throughout the scientific workforce. So if we look at points of attrition, being a leader early on is a huge predictor of staying in the scientific workforce and being a leader later on. It is very difficult to go from a specialized, if you look at that green box, into a leadership and then end up in a leadership career. You sort of get tracked in, again, that path dependency becomes really important. And we look at that by gender, we see striking results there. Women are much more likely to be specialized at all stages of the career, whereas men are much more likely to be leaders in their junior and early career stages. So giving certain students opportunities for leadership during their doctoral program and their earlier career time, again, creates that path dependency for being a leader later on in their career. So let's say you got through doctoral education, you got on a team, you have a publication, and now you're ready to submit it for publication. Actually, let me stop for a second and see, are there questions, Juniper or Antoine?
No, just somebody earlier on saying, hey, the credit taxonomy is great. So then you talked about it. So.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So I think right now it's almost around 200 journals that have adopted the credit taxonomy. So it's really fantastic at standardizing these across. And it has had some critiques from particularly humanities and social sciences that it doesn't take into account all the kinds of tasks that they do. But in creating sort of 14, it has created a much more nuanced ability to look at contributorship and allow us to collect across different platforms and not just be relegated to a certain platform. Any other questions or comments on that, Juniper?
No.
Okay. All right, so you're going to go submit your paper now. So one of the things that we took was the journal eLife. I don't know if all of you are familiar with it, but it is sort of a large open access journal that was started with money from a Nobel Prize. So guy wins the Nobel Prize, says scholarly publishing is completely broken. What's the best thing that we can do? I'm going to start a new journal and I'm going to reinvent how we do peer review. And I'd like it to be much more progressive than it was before. So there are certain things that are slightly different in eLife. And one of those is the process of consultative peer review. So instead of you sending in a manuscript and then me as the editor says, okay, I'm going to have Grace and Antoine and Juniper go review this. And then they send me back their independent reviews and I read it. And then I make a recommendation sending out these 3 individuals. Instead of that, what we do is I bring in Juniper and Antoine and Grace and I say, what do you guys think about this? And they write their comments and we read each other's comments and we keep writing. And then as the editor, I create a consensus report and I make sure everyone's comfortable with it. And the author receives that consensus report. So instead of receiving sort of contradictory information from multiple people, they get one document that we've all agreed upon. Now, it can have conflicting things in and say, we were in a disagreement about this, and so we'd like some explanation, but it's one report that they get. And one of the things I wanted to look at was whether that deliberative peer review would change the kinds of outcomes that we see, particularly in regards to bias in peer review. So we went through their data set. Now, they also have another thing called encouragement, which is pretty much their gatekeeping function and their desk reject. So you send in something that's not your full manuscript and you say, should I even try this? And the editor will say yes or no, just a very quick yes or no. And then you move on to the place where you actually go into the deliberative peer review. So as you look at this, it's a fairly selective journal, especially for a young journal. So there are very few things that are actually encouraged. So much of the material, almost 75% of material, is rejected at the point that you submit it. But once you get encouraged, about half of that goes through a revision. And then most of those things that go out for revision actually do get accepted. So the selectivity actually happens a lot at that encouragement stage. So we looked at this just by gender. And now this is one of the big things you may have seen. There was another publication that came out last week about bias in peer review. And a lot of it says the bias isn't actually bias that's happening in the peer review process. It's at the point of submissions. Women are not submitting in the same proportion as they are in the scientific workforce or even in those disciplines. And that's certainly the case with eLife, that we see that about 25% of submissions in terms of corresponding authors are from women, which is less than we would expect given the biomedical sciences. We would expect in the 30s, 35%. We get closer to that for our first authors, which are our junior authors, and our last authors are much lower as well. But if we just look at the encouragement thing, women are rejected at a significantly higher rate than men. Now, it's small, but it is a meaningful distinction. When we look at the full acceptance, we see a difference there, particularly for corresponding and last authors, which makes that overall acceptance rate for women lower than it is for men. Now, if we look at just those outcomes, we can see again that the outcomes are really different for those last or more senior authors or corresponding, which is also typically a more senior author. Our first authors, we see relatively no difference. So that's good news that our junior authors do not seem to see the same kind of gender bias that our more senior authors do. We also looked at this in terms of country. Now, most of the submissions are coming from the United States, United Kingdom, and Germany, which corresponds with the founding editors for eLife. But if you look at it, we have sort of a mismatch between the gatekeepers and the authors. And so what you see in terms of those lines are our gatekeepers, what they look like and what countries they are from. And I think this is a huge critique of peer review. We think of peer review meaning that the same authorship pool should be those doing the reviewing, but it is systematically different from that. Our gatekeepers are overwhelmingly male and from North America and Europe, compared to our corresponding authors, which tend to be more female, and they tend to be from Asia more than they are represented in the gatekeepers. So we see this mismatch going on there. And for us, we wanted to see whether that had a difference in the outcomes. So we looked at the composition of the teams. And what we looked at was to say, what if you were a male lead author? So you were a last author who was male and you had all male reviewers, all female reviewers, or mixed gender reviewers. What if you were all female team and you had these? And what we found is that men who were reviewed by all men were significantly more likely to be accepted than women. Now, women actually saw the exact same phenomenon, but it's not statistically significant. And why? Because there's only 21 teams where you had all female reviewers and female last authors. So there's a sample size here, but we see that same inversion. And when you have mixed gender reviewers, we saw no difference at all in terms of the outcomes, which suggests a sort of homophily, that when there were women, they were more favorable towards women. When there were men, they were more favorable towards men. We also saw the exact same thing when we looked at country. So if there was at least one Chinese reviewer in the team, the papers from Chinese last authors were significantly more likely to be accepted than not. Same with the US and the United Kingdom. What we found is funny was that the worst scenario was actually France, which inverted it. So if you were French, you really did not want to be reviewed by someone else from France because they would absolutely crush it. So there are definitely cultural things in reviewing. And my co-author here attributes the patterns we see in Canada entirely to the Quebecois because they also invert that as well. So the sort of French critical approach may be the reason that we're seeing that. Now, the problem here is that your probability of homophily is very different based on who you are. If you're from the United States, there's a 91% chance that another reviewer is going to be from the United States. If you're from the UK, that drops down to 30%. If you go to Germany, it's 25%, and then it vastly drops down. So just your probability, if you're Chinese, of being reviewed by someone from China is somewhere around 6%, right? That is much lower than you would expect. So the homophily bias, you could say, well, homophily benefits all people equally. Well, it does, but the probability of being reviewed by someone who is Chinese and female is going to be far lower than being reviewed by someone from the US who is male. So if we look at all of these things together and we throw it into a huge regression, here's how you get accepted. So just to get encouraged to get through the door, you should be from a top institution and be male. Everything else is going to lower your odds of acceptance. Once you get through the door, we see that our last authors from Africa have higher. It's not significant because it's such a small n. So those authors from Africa who make it through that selectivity process tend to be accepted higher rates. But our significant values are, again, being from a top institution, being male, and being reviewed by all men. So what we see here is truly a bias in what's happening in that process, and that deliberative peer review can really change things if we take that homophily into account in positive ways. Now, we also looked at the gender of the reviewing editor and what difference that made on the composition of the teams. And what we found is women were much more likely to pull in women as reviewers and men to pull in men. And if we look at it by their country of origin, if you are from Africa, you are more likely to pull in African reviewers. Asian editors were more likely to bring in Asian reviewers. So there is a policy implication here that we can do. By changing those who are making selections about reviewers, we change the diversity of the reviewer set themselves. And that diversity has payoffs in terms of reducing disparities in the outcomes of peer review. Any questions on that before I go on?
There was a question about how you infer gender of the authors.
Yeah, great question. So throughout all of these studies, we use a gender disambiguation algorithm that is dependent upon the first names mostly. So we use things like the UN census data to look at the probability that a name is female or male, and then we take a really high threshold for that. We also look at the country of origin. So Jean in the US is going to be female, whereas Jean in France is going to be male. For a select number of countries, we actually take the last name. So in certain Soviet and former Soviet countries where the ov or ova is indicative of gender, we use the last names for that. And we did several rounds of manual coding, particularly for Taiwanese names, Chinese names, Korean names to look at that. I will say, I think our gender disambiguation algorithm has gotten stronger and stronger over time, but it still is better for Western names than for Eastern names. Any other questions on that?
What do you do with the authors whose gender can't be inferred?
We leave them out. So
Okay.
we have an unknown category. And one of the interesting things when we did that, so we have sort of things we can classify as male, female, unknown, and then we have initials. And initials are much more prevalent in certain disciplines. So we thought that perhaps women would be more prone to using initials or otherwise circumventing their gender identity. So we did a manual identification of all of those, and we found that they were overwhelmingly male because they are used in math and physics disproportionately, which disproportionately skew male. So what we find is actually, if anything, by removing initials and unknowns, we're actually overestimating female participation in science rather than underestimating it. So that's actually a great lead in. So once you get through all of that, this is the world that you end up with. So if we take all of the Web of Science publications and we look at all of the authorships, and for each country, we take the ratio between the male and female production, we end up with an exceedingly blue world. The bluer it is, the more male dominated, the oranger, the more female dominated. There are very few countries that have higher production by women than men. And most of those countries have lower scientific resources and capacity, things that have exhibited a large degree of brain drain. And if we take in a bunch of data from the OECD and other data sources to understand those countries, and we throw into a big regression, the biggest factor that stands out in predicting women's participation in science is male mortality. So that's not very policy actionable. There is very little that we can do with that, but it highlights a point here that we talk about a lot throughout our studies, is that parity is not necessarily equity. Places that we see parity doesn't necessarily mean something good has happened. It is often that those are impoverished places. And so women have gone into those because they are no longer places of power. So when science is a place of power, we don't see women in it. When science has been devalued in certain places, that's when we see more women in those spaces. Now you may say, well, Web of Science skews towards certain disciplines. So what does that look like across all the disciplines? And here we see that, men dominate in math and physics and chemistry. We start to see more women coming into the biomedical sciences, but by the time we get over to our humanities and social sciences, it's male dominated again. The only places where we see disproportionate women are in what we would consider care disciplines: education, librarianship, social work, speech and language pathology are all places where we see more women. Now, many of those disciplines are in lower regard in terms of resource allocation, salaries, and other kinds of rewards and resources, which again shows that parity paradox playing in. So I'll sort of end that part when we ask, is science open to all? I will say no, science is not open equally to all or equitably to all. And there's a lot that we can do to ensure that science encompasses more participants and is more open to everyone. Any questions before I go on that?
Yeah. So there's a question in the chat that asks how you infer fields from the bibliometric data.
Yeah. So we use a mapping of the Web of Science classifications onto the National Science Foundation classification. So there's a mapping between those journals. Web of Science has things like multidisciplinary. So science and nature all fall into that. It becomes really problematic. And there's also multiple classifications. So a journal can appear in multiple. To make it exclusive, we put it into the National Science Foundation. And then we can use various things when we're doing it to the individual level. So we can understand it at the paper level and look at that. And most of the things that we've done before have been at that paper level. So a paper is here and it has certain male and female authorships. Now, there's a distinction between authorships, just is that author a male or female, and then the actual author over time. And so we also have a disambiguated data set where we can look at an author and their entire body of work and follow them over time, which gives us different levels of understanding about productivity. For those kinds of things, it becomes much harder, particularly when someone is multidisciplinary and they're going through lots of different disciplines. And for that, we'll often use the discipline in which the majority of their publications fall or other spaces like that. Other questions? Nicholas?
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a really quick question. Sorry if you mentioned this, but as far as review goes, being a reviewer is another aspect of that, that it's basically unpaid labor and that it maybe disproportionately affects minorities.
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question and one that we're digging into now. We just received the Publons data set. So we're looking to see more about who's being asked to review, because we hear both sides of it. We hear on the one side that certain populations feel like their voice is not being heard in science, but then there is also the disproportionate burden that many underrepresented minorities face in science in terms of service obligations. So in trying to achieve a quota on certain panels or review committees or service obligation, there is a taxation that happens particularly to underrepresented minorities. One of the issues is that taxation is largely concentrated among a few minorities. And so you have a few underrepresented minorities who are taxed with service burdens disproportionately, and then many who receive no voice in science. And so we see sort of both ends of that spectrum there. So it's very important, I think, when people go into these sorts of modes of increasing diversity, that they also distribute that across the entire population. Now, as being in the sort of probability spectrum, right? If you are an underrepresented minority and you're trying to be equally represented, there is going to be cultural taxation that happens there. But trying to distribute as much as possible, I think, is really important. And because many of these individuals end up on the periphery of these academic networks, those who are the few that actually are in the center become overwhelmingly represented in these spaces. And so there's a lot that happens, I think, in there that we have to be very careful about as we move forward.
I think
Other
that's the
questions?
last question. Yeah.
Okay. And sorry, I keep like dodging. There's like this crazy light coming in my
Sunbeam.
window. Yeah, so I'm gonna scoot over to the corner. Okay. So does this matter? Does this change the questions that are asked? And this is something that people ask me all the time. They say, okay, so, you know, why does it matter? Does it matter if a woman is holding the pipette or a man is? Does it matter who's asking the questions? Why should we have diversity other than reasons of just social justice and equity? So we did a slightly different study here, and we took PubMed and we looked at the mesh headings and tried to understand which populations were studied. So rather than looking at who was doing the science, we were looking at what they were studying. So in biomedical research, were they taking into account the sex of the cell that they were using? And by and large, they're not, right? So we see that there's a slight increase in incorporating both sexes into the analysis, and a low rates of male or female, but overwhelmingly there is no sex. So sex is not included as an analytic variable, and we don't explore sex in the results. Now you may say, well, that's fine because they're looking at cells and the sex of the cell doesn't matter. But as many of you probably even know better than I do, dependent on your field, it really matters. The way in which male and female cells respond to stress is very different. The way in which they absorb lipids is very different. And what we see is 8 out of 10 drugs that are withdrawn from the market are withdrawn because they have adverse effects for women, because they were tested on men and not tested on women. And so we know that there are differences in how these are going to respond, particularly in the pharmaceutical industry. Now, when we get into clinical medicine, we're starting to see a huge increase in including both sexes into the study. So when we're doing more of the mammal studies here, we're incorporating both male and females. And by the time we get to public health, where we're definitely incorporating human subjects, we're seeing a lot more of that. Now, much of that was a direct response to places like the National Institutes of Health, who started mandating it in their grants, that you must include sex as an analytic variable and you must include both sexes unless you could provide ample justification for why you did not. Now, if we look at this, how it plays out in different disciplines, it makes sense, right? We're much more likely to study females only in obstetrics and gynecology. Urology is much more likely to study males only. But if we start playing through it, why would we see pharmacology disproportionately studying men? Why is addictive diseases or physiology mostly men, right? And we look at those, we know very different things about male and female bodies within each of these different disciplines based on who was studied. So we took our gender overlay and we looked at it from the author perspective. And what we found was if you had just one female author, either the last or the first female author, you were disproportionately more likely to include sex as an analytic variable and to study both men and women in it. If you had both a male and female first and last author, that was the most likely that you were going to include sex as an analytic variable and study both men and women. And so we see these huge differences across these spaces when we look at it. So to me, this is a really powerful finding, that the more women who go into the biomedical sciences, the more we know about the female body. And given that they make up 50% of the bodies and 100% of the birthing bodies that we have, this seems pretty important to me. Now, of course, we looked at this from gender, which is a little bit easier for us to ascribe than doing a race or ethnicity. But my guess would be that we would see probably similar things, that people from different backgrounds are more likely to take those backgrounds into account when they're doing their studies, and therefore know more about how different kinds of medicines, different kinds of structures, whether we're taking this from medicine to political science to economics, how each of these things are affecting different communities. And so I think incorporating diversity into science is not just merely a thing about social justice, but that the diversification of the scientific workforce actually creates new kinds of knowledges. It shares new things about the world that we didn't know before. Questions, comments?
Oh, yeah, there's a question in the chat. Is there a bias of field by gender that would correlate authorship to field and whether they cover genders other than male? Emily, if I didn't describe that well, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, basically, so you're saying like having a woman as an author means that you're more likely to take women into account. And I'm saying, well, is that because these are fields where like women are more, not just more represented, but it also like has to be women, because like gynecology, for example, are women overrepresented in gynecology? And these are the fields where women are, it's women are not only the subject of the study, therefore you have to take them into account, but women are also the authors of the study. So if you're looking at sort of a field that is less or has better gender parity in the terms of the people, are those studies more likely to be not concerned with women?
Right, absolutely. No, absolutely. There is absolutely an intersection over those things. And so the space is, if a woman goes into medicine and she's disproportionately likely to go into gynecology rather than pharmacology, then that sort of perpetuates it. And there's a cyclicality to it. So we're less likely to incorporate women's issues into it. And then it may also not be as attractive a discipline to go into as well. So I think that there's both a space in which disciplines are attractive because the issues there that the author would be facing are represented in the discipline. So there's also that kind of affinity and homophily that's happening in selection of a discipline, the culture of a discipline, and then that in turn reinforces what's studied within that discipline. So I think there's a cyclical reinforcement effect. There is definitely a selection effect that's happening there, and there's an affinity homophily bias that's baked into that cyclicality. So I think absolutely that plays a role in it. All right, more questions?
Yeah, there's a question about if you could speak to sort of why public health disproportionately focuses on female only. Is that the opposite direction though? I'm not sure.
Public health is the most likely to take both sexes into account in the studies and to use human subjects rather than sort of mammal non-human mammals as their cases. But we do see in the public health, we do study women more. And I'm not sure why we see that within that very specialized field. That I do not have a thing. We also see the same thing for nursing, that we see disproportionate women relative to men studied there. And public health is one of the fields that we have disproportionate amounts of women in.
Women have higher.
Laurent was saying that women have higher health-seeking behavior in general.
I mean, if that's
which
all
I think is
studies
empirically true in our lives.
Yeah.
All right, that was the last comment. Sorry.
It does go with what Emily said as well. There are more women in public health as authors, right? So that plays a role there too. All right, so sort of shifting gears to a different kind of openness. So we've sort of gone through all of these spaces of being an author, but now we're going to think about how those authors move across the globe, what kinds of mobility are exhibited by these different authors. So every single agency that you look at right now, every sort of both aggregate or federal sort of space will tell you how great mobility is, right? Mobility serves to strengthen scientific capacities, benefit scientific careers. It is an important role in fostering high quality knowledge production. Now, of course, right now, and we'll talk about the pandemic in a second, all of this is sort of on hold right now because of the pandemic, and we're trying to reconsider what scientific mobility looks like right now, but we'll sort of hold that aside for a second and go into it. So in the last few years, we've seen several spaces that have looked to limit and restrict mobility. So certainly the immigration ban and Brexit are different ways in which we move towards a nationalistic rather than a global scientific sort of space. And we have a bit of a tension that we always play with globalization in science. And this is something that I certainly found while working at the National Science Foundation for the last 2 years, is we have sort of this notion of competition and this rhetoric of competition, right? We always say, who published more, right? China's challenging American dominance of science. Like, we have to make sure that we are winning science. And to me, that's always been a very strange rhetoric, right? If there's a cure for cancer, I think everyone benefits. So the idea of competition in science, particularly competition that is measured through production and citation, has always seemed to me a very odd thing. But this is the kind of tension that we see. So we're trying to assert our dominance by being more productive. And there's this space of fear, right? This fear that our knowledge is going to be stolen from us. So the notion of competitive intelligence, particularly for scientific work, has been amplified in the last 4 years as certain government agencies have looked into the theft of our intellectual property to other countries. So this is a really fascinating space. On the one hand, you're arguing for a global scientific community, for mobility, for exchange of information. And on the other hand, you're thinking about isolationism, protectionism, particularly of things that you think might have security issues or consequences. Is there a question or comment?
No, the only comment was just that in behavioral ecology, the sort of female bias also plays out like female scientists studying songbirds.
Oh, interesting. Well, that's really cool. Thanks. I like that. So one of the things.
Sorry, there was also another comment about like historically experiments on model organism would focus on males only, for instance, because they considered sex as a confounding variable.
But and many of them went on the argument, well, there's 2 arguments, the volatility and vulnerability argument. So the volatility is that women are just far too volatile, right? Their hormones are all over the place and their cycles are going to interfere and create noise in the study. And so we won't know whether that same thing is because the mouse was ovulating or it was actually a true manifestation. But what people have actually found is that men have great deals of hormonal variation across patterns as well, right? And so what we've thought about is the female variability is often matched or exceeded depending on the model that we're using in that. So that sort of volatility argument, I think, has been fairly well disproven. Then there was the vulnerability, right? Well, we can't possibly study women or children because women might be pregnant and we might harm the children and it could be a harm to women and women aren't sturdy enough to be studied. So there's this sort of sense that we're protecting women by removing them from human subjects research. And so I think there have been a lot of narratives that have been both either to protect women or that women were simply too unpredictable to be studied. And I think that we're getting to a point where we're recognizing that A, we can control for that and measure that, and that B, maybe some of that is not actually true when we compare to men's volatility. Other questions, comments? Okay, so to measure mobility, there are so many data sets. The Eurostat, OECD, NSF, everyone is measuring mobility. They're looking at where you're from, where you're going, trying to understand what are the predictors of movement and how you're moving. We're doing different entrance and exit kinds of interviews. The problem with all of those is that they look at stock rather than flow. That is, they're looking at, in our country right now, how many people do we have who were not born here working in science? They look at that aggregate number rather than how an individual is traversing across that space. It doesn't account for these short-term stays and these visitations. Rather, it just looks at people who immigrate or emigrate. There are huge delays in reporting. Once you get a survey on mobility, the minute you get the data, it's dated, right? It's already out of date and we're not able to do it. And it takes years to do these large-scale surveys. There's idiosyncratic practices in data collection. So trying to compare between the OECD data and the Eurostat data is impossible. Even their definition of what constitutes a highly skilled worker is totally different across these different data sets. So the data is really not comparable. There's response bias, and there's different conceptualizations. So it's always been a persistent policy need to be able to create a global data set that will tell us something about scientific mobility. So we turned to bibliometric data to try to do that. So we took the Web of Science, and for the Web of Science, we have various different pieces of metadata that can help us extract that. We can match an author to a certain institution at a given date of publication. Now, there are many limitations in this, and I can walk you through all of those limitations. But what this allows us to do is trace that individual through time and across space according to their publication record to see where they have been, what affiliations that they have had. Now, we try to class this in different ways. Now, first of all, I should say that there are very, very few, a very small proportion of authors within the Web of Science have ever had an instance of mobility. That is, that they have published with 2 different countries. Most people are publishing within a single country. Now, of course, most people are also only publishing 1 to 3 publications. We have a lot of attrition within the scientific workforce, so you have to take that into account. So there's this very small group of sort of elite mobile researchers who published in multiple countries. But what we found was that these were not always cases of migrations. So migrations only made up about 1/4 of these mobility patterns. And what we saw there is someone publishes first in Canada, and then maybe they publish in Canada for 1 or 2 years, and then they publish in the US. And there's a clear break between their country of origin, which we're classing as the first country in which they published, and then the country to which they have immigrated. And so what we see there is they migrated. They moved from one country to another. Now, what we also see, though, is a lot of people who publish in Canada, and then they publish in the US and Canada, and they never lose that country of affiliation. And maybe they publish in the US for a while, and then in Sweden for a while, and then in South Africa for a while. And what we're seeing is all of those affiliations that they're gathering. So those visiting professorships, those short-term stays, those interactions at different institutions, which don't necessarily have a movement associated with them, that they are leaving their country of origin and moving to a new place. So we were very interested in these sort of travelers, whether these travelers went into a direction or whether these travelers actually stayed in the same 2 countries throughout their whole time. So we had many people who started publishing in China and the US and published in China and US throughout their entire space. So we call those non-directional travelers, people who we don't see sort of a movement to or away from a certain country, rather just a joint publication across 2 different countries. Now, if we just look at that movement, those migrants, that small 1/4 of that small percentage who actually moved places, we can take those who started their publication, their first publication was in 2008, and we can watch their flows across time. And what you see is Europe losing scholars, North America gaining scholars, Oceania also gaining some scholars, and Asia losing scholars as well. And you can watch their flows and patterns through time. Now, one of the things that we see here, of course, though, is the problem with equating country of origin with their first paper in which they published. So many of our Asian authors that returned to Asia in a closer examination were actually students from Asia who came to the United States, did their doctoral work, published their first work in the US, which puts them as sort of a North American author, and then they moved back home to Asia. And so there's a problem here with the bibliometric data of not really understanding the geographic country of origin, only the bibliometric country of origin. But we do see a very interesting production advantage. And of course, there's a chicken and an egg thing here. But we see if we look at those who have the proportion of researchers who have different areas of mobility by their production, we find that we see a lot more publications for our travelers, and particularly our directional travelers. So as your publication increases, so too does your probability that you're publishing in more than one country. By the time we get to those who have 50 or more publication, about 35 to 40% of all of our scholars have published in at least 2 countries by then. So there really is this skew in this distribution. Now, is it because you're more productive that you're more likely to get invitations for visiting professorships or other areas of mobility, or is it your mobility that leads to it? That's unclear, but it seems to be up till about 30 publications, an increasing probability with your publications and your traveling. Now, mobility peaks a little bit earlier, around 12. And what we can think about is if you're constantly changing institutions and recreating a new network, that's going to have different problems for you in terms of your productivity. You're going to have to sort of restart your lab every time, whereas traveling seems to have much better effects at increasing your productivity. We see a different effect though for our MNCS, our mean normalized citation scores. So your citation per publication seems to go up dramatically for migrants, then for our directional travelers, then our non-directional travelers, and the non-mobile. So there is really a relation here between movement and citation, which makes sense. The more that your network is exposed to other networks, the more you are exposed to other spaces, the more people are likely to cite you. Now, how does that play out in some of the other variables that we've looked at? Well, if we look at gender, we see an interesting thing. So if we look at the proportion of all your collaborations and whether they're national or international, there are certainly country differences. So smaller countries like Austria, Switzerland, or the Philippines, most people are writing more in international collaborations than domestic collaborations. Larger countries with more scientific capacity like China and the United States have more national collaboration. But invariant of country, women's networks are more domestic, whereas men's are more international. So men's collaboration networks are more likely to be international than women's, which gives them different access to different collaborators, different citation patterns, and different resources. And we can see that role in mobility as being very different across country. So we actually see higher degrees of mobility from the global south for women than in other places. So a lot of different sort of mobility spaces that are happening there. By and large, if we look across all disciplines, women are less likely to be travelers or migrants. Men are more likely to be travelers and migrants across all those spaces. So this tells us that scientific mobility is simply not open to everyone, right? Not everyone is equally able to be mobile. People who have care responsibilities, either elder care or child care, people who have these different spaces are less likely to get these sort of traveling, visiting professorships, to have these short-term stays, or to take these long-term stays. So particularly in countries that mandate mobility for promotion and other resources, provides a sort of a disadvantage to those who cannot be mobile for any reason, whether it's disability or personal reasons. Okay, I'm checking the time. All right. So then we have the pandemic, right? So this is changing, I'm jumping to the sun. Okay, this is changing many of the things that we see happening. So I'll start with a little story about the growth of preprints over time. So if we look at the number of preprints, particularly those that are dealing with the biomedical sciences, we see that, they were coming along in 2016, 17, 18. And then if we look at 2020, you see there's a massive explosion of preprints coming out, and many, many, many preprints coming out about the coronavirus. So what we did was right after the pandemic started and lockdown started occurring everywhere, we went through and grabbed a bunch of preprint reports, so about 300,000 preprints and registered reports from about 1.3 million authors. So arXiv, medRxiv, EarthArchive, NBER, SocArchive preprints, to try to understand how this pandemic was affecting different kinds of authors. And if we look at the percentage of female first authors contributing by platform, we see that arXiv is really stable. If we look at February, March, and April, we don't see a huge effect happening there. Now, this is disproportionately male, so that may be why. BioArchive, we see some very small fluctuations, but it's in medRxiv where we see a dramatic drop right when lockdowns start occurring. Now, we can look at that over time as it moves, and you see that once you get towards June, this starts bouncing back up, particularly for our first authors. Now, our last authors don't see as much of a dip, but remember that our last authors are more likely to be senior authors. So our first authors are more likely to be those who have dependents at home and young school-age dependents at home. Now, the other thing we looked at, and this is relative to the study before of looking at who is studying what, we wanted to see who was studying COVID itself and the percentage of female first authors that were contributing by platform. And we found that they were much less likely to be studying COVID than their male counterparts. So this tells us two things. One is being able to study COVID in those first few months means you have to be able to pivot quickly, right? That you have the resources to pivot, that you can put in the time and resources there. We don't see it there. The consequence of this is if there are gender differences in the virus, those are less likely to be studied given what we know from the previous work that we've done. And now we've continued monitoring this. We have a shiny real-time app that's been going for months and months and months. And what's been really interesting is that it sort of, let's see, how far did I get this through 620, 1120, there we go. is that we saw sort of a self-correcting effect here, where it dropped down in March and April. It sort of hit its bottom at the end of April, and then it started bouncing back up. And then we felt like it was about at where we would expect it to be given rates last year. And then it started dropping again in November. And what I think that we're seeing here too is the return to school. So as we see a bunch of, over the summer, we can kind of self-correct it. But then as we move to school, we have things happening. Students who are still home from school and parents who are disproportionately likely to be doing caregiving responsibilities there, women who have teaching loads and have to move to an online teaching load, which requires an increased burden, female academics who are disproportionately likely to be doing service within the academy are doing that, and we start to see this decline again. So what really concerns me about this is that we're going to see sort of long-term consequences of this pandemic on women's work, and particularly on junior scholars' work as they move to this. So there's an entire cohort now whose work has been delayed, postdocs that have been delayed, postdocs who've never actually been in the lab in which they were hired because it's not open yet, a hiring freezes across universities, which are meaning that many of those who were graduating last year or this year are unable to find work. And really just a huge consequence to a disproportionately female and minority population as they're trying to take that very pivotal step into their academic careers. So I think that these are going to be problems. Now, what I always say through all of these is the pandemic didn't really create all of these, it amplified the pre-existing disparities. So female academics are disproportionately likely to be doing caregiving compared to male academics. These are things that we know. They're disproportionately less likely to have a partner whose primary responsibility is the children than a male academic. And so all of these things are sort of amplified. When we create this sort of archetypal ideal academic who has no dependents, who doesn't have to breastfeed, who doesn't need to take frequent breaks, we've created an environment where any exogenous factor, like a pandemic, is likely to disproportionately affect those populations. So there's a lot of work that we need to do to academe to ensure that it has greater flexibility, greater mobility to deal with these, to sort of absorb these exogenous shocks without disproportionately placing the burden on certain populations. All right, I'm checking the time. I might skip through some of this. Are there any questions before we go on?
I don't
Okay.
think so.
All right, then I think I might want to skip, and we can come back to this. I'll put the PowerPoint up. I think I'm going to skip through some of the open access things. I think many of you are aware of open access spaces. So those are things that maybe we can skip through. I'll just say one thing briefly about this is that we did a study to look at compliance with funders' open access mandates. And we find wildly different compliance rates based on country and based on kinds of platforms that we have, with Canada doing particularly poorly in this in terms of compliance. And what we've found really is fascinating when we look at the cultures of compliance. So many disciplines will say, well, I can't possibly be open access because I'm in chemistry and we have so much sensitive material. And if all my work is made openly available, it's going to be stolen and there's going to be negative effects for the world. And what's fascinating to me is that if you look at the compliance at the National Institutes of Health for chemistry, it's about 81% compliant. If you look at NSF or NSERC, we get down to 24 and 10% compliance. So what we see is cultures of compliance are really driven by infrastructures and institutions that are ensuring that science is made openly available, and that sort of the individualistic complaints about why something can't be made available suddenly is overcome when you create the appropriate infrastructure for it. So there's a lot to be said on open access, and happy to talk about that with anyone, but I think I'll skip through that and move here. I will say during the pandemic, what we found were there are these, this huge movement towards open access. So there was a welcome trust statement that had signatories from all of the major publishers, all of the major funders, mandating that everything be made openly available during the pandemic. And they said, we must do this where there is a significant public health benefit to ensuring data is shared widely and rapidly. So in that moment, all of these funders and all of these agencies basically made the statement that sharing data is better for public health. And so our argument has always been, is there not a public health benefit to making all publicly funded research available, to accelerate all kinds of discovery in biomedicine and save lives. And so we really push for openness across the space. If we need OA during a pandemic, we also need OA outside of a pandemic. All right, so we'll go through some rewards and then sort of move towards an ending. So the other thing that we look at are citations that are accrued. And basically, if we look at this across all countries and all collaboration types, that being a single author yields the lowest citations. And if you're a female single author, you receive fewer citations than a male. Now, national collaborations, you get a few more citations, but in each and every one of these, if you're a female first or last author, you're cited less than male first and last authors. Now, international collaborations have the highest citations, but again, if you are a female first or last author, those papers receive fewer citations than male first and last authored. And if you remember, we have that sort of compound disadvantage that women are less likely to be in international collaborations than men as well. So they are less likely to get the benefit and that sort of citation bump of the international collaborations, and their work is less cited overall. Now, if we just look within the US, we also see a disadvantage at the intersection of race and gender. So in these studies that we're doing right now, we look at the likelihood that a surname is associated with race just using data within the US. And what's fascinating is that we still see that the gender holds a dominant role in this, that across the spectrum, Asian, Black, Hispanic, and white authors, male authors are cited at a higher rate than female authors of that same race or ethnicity. And I won't stop here to sort of problematize the census's categories on race and ethnicity. We can have a conversation about that, but sort of using these data here. What becomes fascinating to me in a sort of horrifying way is what particularly happens with our Black and Hispanic authors. So when a name is, 10% Black, it's likely to be 90% white. And so we see very little difference between the Black and white. At the point when a male name is 90% Black, where it's going to be perceived by a reader as being a Black surname, we drop dramatically at that point for both Black and Hispanic authors. So names that signify a Black or Hispanic author to a very high degree are associated with very low citation counts. And it happens at that breaking point in a very dramatic way. The fact that our female Black and Hispanic authors are always undercited is also a really terrifying sort of phenomenon. So when we look at this, there is that intersectionality that when we are reading an author, when we are perceiving that, there is sort of an implied race or gender that's coming in. Now, whether that's an accurate race or gender is a totally different conversation, and one that I would really love to have. But even those perceived attributes are changing the reception within the scholarly community. Now, you may say, well, it's just because, women and underrepresented minorities aren't putting their work in the right venues. If only they would publish in Science and Nature and PNAS, they would be cited at higher rates. So what we looked at is the impact factor of the journals in which men and women were publishing. And in many cases, women in earth and space sciences and biology and engineering and social sciences are publishing in journals of higher impact factors than their male counterparts, yet they are still cited to a lower degree. And you may say, okay, but you're using averages and there's a lot of skewness in that, which is true. So if we put these little quintiles and deciles, we can look at it and see that there's very little difference in citation in the lowest ranked journals. But as you move up and up and up, the citation disparity increases. It is precisely in Science and Nature and PNAS and Cell that we see the largest gap between men and women's citation receipt. Now, there are some differences happening when we look at altmetric indicators. So men are still overrepresented on blogs and Wikipedia in newspaper articles. But when we start to look at Mendeley, bookmarking services, or Twitter, we start to see an amplification of women's work, particularly in some disciplines, clinical medicine, earth and space science, social sciences. And we're starting to see what I would like to see is no difference at all in the amplification of work. And so there are many things, about a third of disciplines, we see no difference in the amplification of work across Twitter. So there may be some good news in sort of the space for the amplification of this work. Now, if we look at open access, we see a different kind of story. In almost every case, women are more likely to publish in open access than men, which may play into that sort of Twitter finding. Things in open access are more likely to be received on social media. The exception here is in Russia, Turkey, and Spain, where men's work is more in open access. But of course, this brings us back to that parity paradox issue we talked about before. Are they publishing in open access because of ideological values, or are these journals of lower rank or lower quality, right? What is the space between these? Are these high prestige open access or low prestige open access journals? And there's a lot to be said in that space. Now, the other thing that I want to bring attention to when we're looking at citations is the homophily effect that happens in citations as well. So if we look just at continent, and we look at the percentage of citation received or the percentage of references made, we see great homophily. So 63% of the citations that are received for Asian authors come from Asia. 50% of those citations received by Europe come from European authors. And we see this across the board. We also see it in references. You are much more likely to reference your countrymen, which then means cite your countrymen. So just as we see a shift in the productivity of certain nations, we're going to see a shift in citedness of those nations. Asia now outperforms, China outperforms the United States in terms of production of journal articles, which means they're also outperforming in production of references. And if those references are going to be disproportionately assigned to other Asian authors, we're going to see shifts in that. So it's very critical when we're looking at citations as metrics to understand the pool of available references for them. If you are from a smaller niche field, a smaller country, a niche specialty, the probability of receiving citations is just simply lower, not because of quality, not because of impact, but because of the size of your field and the size of the population that will be aware of your work. We also see that by each and every country. It's not just at the continent level. So scientific rewards are not distributed equally, but openness helps. So very last one, I know I only have 1 minute left, so I'll just sort of introduce this, and then if it piques anyone's interest, we can talk about it in the mentor meetings. Is science open for debate? So one of the things that we've tried to think about are negative citations, disagreements in science, lack of consensus. And so one of the things we did is we took in-text citations, and we took over 3 million articles in Science Direct, which are Elsevier journals published between 1998 and 2015. And we extracted all of the sentences, all of the times where you have a reference that's written into a sentence. And then we spent weeks and weeks and weeks, years, I won't even tell you how many times we did to create a category of all of the words that would be indicative of a dispute, of a disagreement, of a refutation. And so each of these signal items represents a very, very, very long query where we've excluded certain words, included different words, provided every different manifestation of that. And our filter terms also have very, very, very long queries, which are trying to understand, are we looking at a disagreement with a study, a disagreement with a theory and an idea, with a methodological thing, or with the result of a study? And so we took all of those different spaces, and you can see some of the examples of valid and invalid comments that would be in there. And we took 50 sentences from each and every one of those boxes, and we manually coded them. So this has really taken years to do, to say, is that a valid representation of a disagreement in science? And so we have both validity and agreement. How well do we agree that something is a disagreement? And we agree pretty well. So for almost in everything except for, which I find ironic, questionable. The word questionable, we couldn't agree whether that was disagreement or not, but for every other term, we really agreed that it was disagreement when we saw it. But if we look at the validity of the sections that we took, there's huge variability in whether we've got valid results using these queries that we generated over years. And in the end, we come up with a very small amount of these spaces where 80% of them were valid and we agreed on their validity. And so just trying to identify disagreement in science was actually a very difficult, cumbersome kind of process, which I can talk about. But if we use those things, what we find is that our disagreement by field follows sort of Comte's hierarchy of sciences, where he says that physics is less complex and has more consensus, whereas the social sciences are highly complex and less consensus. And we see exactly that space, is that there was much more disagreement within the social sciences and the humanities, and then very few disagreements that happen in the mathematics and computational sciences. And you can kind of see the space. Of course, look at the percent agreement. In every case, it's less than 1%. So there is very little debate actually happening within these pages of scientific works as measured through all of these terms that we used. So across the board, we find that more social fields have more disagreement, But we found these very interesting bubbles in the microfield. So for example, in life and earth sciences, a lot of debate over the age of the earth, right? And the age of certain rocks. So we see some debate that's happening in those spaces where there's disagreement, where there's a lack of consensus. If we look at it over time, it is wildly stable. So we're not seeing huge increases. And if anything, we're seeing decreases in debate within the social sciences, mathematics, physical life. Only the biomedical sciences is slightly higher debate, but very, very, very slight. We also looked at the kinds of papers people were disagreeing with. And basically, we're disagreeing more with younger papers. So older papers, we sort of disagree with them, and then over time, we stop disagreeing with them. And so we're only disagreeing with things that are novel and new and sort of coming out, things that continue to be cited over time, we give positive endorsement to rather than negative endorsement. So largely, science isn't open for debate within its pages. We think about this sort of consensus building, but we're not engaging in very explicit debate within the text of the scientific journals, which I find really fascinating given the other kinds of debate that we're into right now. So someone asked me in the chat, but I haven't responded to yet, about this retracted article that came out recently. And we can definitely have a conversation about that and what happened. But the debate didn't happen within scientific papers. The debate happened on Twitter. And as the debate unfolded on Twitter, it spurred and acted as a catalyst for the editors of Nature Communications to have new reviews come out, to examine those reviews, and it led to an author-led retraction. The point of the retraction has also been heavily debated on Twitter too, whether the retraction is a censorship or sort of in some ways a negative effect on science and a dampening effect on science, or whether it was a really positive way in which the scientific community's voice was finally heard. But what's fascinating to me is the other spaces where debate is held. And it's not happening within the scientific pages, but it's happening in these outside pages. And whether that's a good thing or bad thing, I think is open for debate. So I'll just end here. I think, we talk about openness, and I am definitely pro openness in science, and it's, open access and open data and open education and everything should be open, and open is really, really good. But open can also be dangerous, and we have to be aware of some of those dangers. So in this one study that we did, we took about 10,000 images from Google Scholar, Microsoft Academic Search, and Mendeley, and we looked at just the images, just the head and shoulder shot. And we found about 80% were male, over 35, white, head and shoulders, indoors, in casual black clothes. So they were basically all Steve Jobs. And that maps on pretty well with what we know of what a scientist looked like. But then we did a survey on Mechanical Turk, and we controlled for all of those things. Are they smiling or are they not? What age are they? What colors are they wearing? And then we asked two subjective questions. Is this person professional? And is this person attractive? And women were disproportionately likely to be seen as pretty, but not professional, and men as professional, but not pretty, given all the same sort of characteristics. So that has huge implications when we think about openness. As soon as you're applying for a job, the first thing someone's going to do is do a Google search on you. And if they have that implicit bias based on the way you look, on your gender, on your race, on your age, they're going to bring that into the decision-making space, which we saw in this Moss-Racusin study that was done, where they sent out identical CVs, absolutely identical in every way, except switching the names so that it implied a male name or a female name. And then they asked the candidates, how competent do you find this person? And men were seen as more competent, more hireable, more likely to receive mentoring. And when they asked them how much they would pay the male student versus the female student, a huge disparity in pay based on identical CVs. And what's shocking about this is it wasn't just given to male PIs. It was given to male and female PIs who were both disproportionately likely to overrank the male candidates compared to the female candidates. We also didn't talk a lot about open access, but I think it's fair to think about the disparities that are created there. We say open access is good, but as people move towards open access, we see this huge spectrum where the APC cost, the cost to publish, go from $1,000 to Nature Communication was at $5,200, and I'm sure you've all seen the new Nature things coming out at $10,000. So we say, great, science is free to be read, but the only people who can write science are those who have $10,000. And that becomes a very different space. And when we think about openness, it's open for readers, but not open for authors. And that can create huge disparities within science as well. So ending. I promise, Jennifer, you don't have to like cut me off. I put this picture up here, and many of you probably know these statistics, but women are almost 50% more likely to be injured and 17% more likely to die in a car crash. And one of the reasons people have found for that is because they didn't introduce female crash dummies when they were doing testing until 2003. And when they introduced them, they were cast as 5 foot tall and 110-pound scaled down male version. And they were only put in the passenger seat. So unless you are 5 foot tall, 110 pounds, and only riding in the car, you are non-compliant. If you are driving the car and if you're outside of those specifications, the car is not meant for you. And your non-compliance is the reason that you're having these disproportionate injuries. And I think in the same way, science is built for a certain kind of person that has certain kinds of needs, that has certain kinds of support systems, that has certain kinds of infrastructures, that is from a certain country and from a certain institution. And what we need to do is, how do we fit science to fit a broader array of people, to fit the actual proportion of those who can and should and are in the scientific workforce? So to me, that's a lot of what I think about in science policy, is how do we think about how we can refit science, not tell women and underrepresented minorities and people from the global south and from non-elite institutions how they can game the system to look more like the archetypal scientific worker. That's not the way this is. We shouldn't fix the scientists. We need to fix science. We need transparency. So I do believe in openness and transparency, and studying eLife, other institutions that open themselves up to scrutiny, I think allow us to create these better systems that we want. We need better data sets. I use Web of Science and other data sets, but I am the first to critique them and tell you how they are very, very limited in what they can tell us. So we need to create the data sets that will allow us to do the kinds of studies that we need. We need openness in both the consumption of science, but also in the reward system of science. And my very, very last slide is, we also need to think about all of the pieces on the spectrum. So a couple of years ago, we undertook a flip where we took a journal that was under Elsevier ownership and we flipped it and made it a community-owned journal. And this was a huge process over years and all of the pieces moving together. And we finally go with MIT Press for a partnership. And we're like, yeah, okay, we've done it. And our first meeting, they say, okay, what do you want for your editorial management system? And the option they give us is Elsevier's. And we were flabbergasted. We spent this whole time trying to do this big flip. And yet embedded in the system were all of these proprietary databases. And you always come to a point in making change where you realize there is some space that is still not owned by the community, that is still not able to be malleable in the way that it needs to be. And so we had to push back. We had to go and delay our whole process in order to not take that option. But we really do need fully open, fully community-owned, fully scientifically owned infrastructure for science. So on that, I know I went over, but I want to thank you, and I look forward to our conversations.
Great. Join me in thanking Cassidy. Okay, we can take some questions if folks want to either unmute themselves or raise their hands.
Yeah, so Samin, I think you have a question. You raised your hand.
Thanks a lot, Cassidy, for the great presentation. So I just had a comment about migration and mobility. So I work at the Demographic Research Institute, and we usually mention that migration as a whole is a rare event, and then migration and mobility within academia is actually, relatively common. As this subpopulation is much more mobile than other populations. And then I had a question about the journal you mentioned. I was just wondering, was it called QSS before the flip as well?
No, it was Journal of Informametrics. And so, of course, Elsevier said, well, you didn't really flip it. You just left us and created a new journal. And so it's like, okay, the semantics of that. But yeah, so it was Journal of Informametrics before, and now it's QSS.
but as long as the community knows about this, I think it is a flip. So I've seen it in mathematics, in a lot of mathematics journal, and yeah.
Mhm.
So this wasn't a question, but perhaps useful information by Alice about the Women in Network Science seminars. I don't know if you want to. Anyway, if you look at the chat, there's a website if you're interested. I think I skimmed through the presentation, the lecture, and there's a lot of very interesting talks, interesting people. So I don't know if Alice, you want to say something or just leave it with my awkward presentation.
I'm just going to say that actually it's talks like Cassidy's today that have inspired that. So there was work on the citation gap in neuroscience that has inspired the Women in Network Science seminar to be a thing. So during term time, and term time starts usually a week after term because that's when I get my shit together. We have every Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern time a talk by a woman in network science, and the goal of this seminar series is specifically to highlight work by women so that you can cite them in the future, so that we have less of a citation gap the next time Cassidy runs statistics on that. And thanks for the talk. That was absolutely inspiring today.
Thanks, Alice. And thanks for your work in doing that.
So maybe we have time for 2 more questions.
Grace, did you have one?
Yeah, just quickly. So Cassidy, I really enjoyed a lot of this talk. I feel like I'm thinking about a lot of these ideas now. But one question that popped up in my head was there are clearly a lot of benefits to migration when doing science. Did you detect any costs? And if so, what are those costs?
Yeah, that was one thing that we wanted to play with more, was that the cost of migration. So the travelers seem to see sort of continual benefits. So the more institutions you add to your resume and sort of visiting prof and other things had benefits. If there were degrees of very fast mobility within a short period of time, that seemed to have a cost for you. So actually migrating, severing ties with institutions and starting more looked like a cost. There have been a few really interesting studies from the Chinese system looking at those who went to the US to do their things and when they come back. And there was a huge cost for those scholars in terms of reestablishing a network. So those who stayed within China were more built into the Chinese academic system, were able to navigate it there, and particularly the ability to get grants within that country. So there are lots of things based on sort of the guanzhou, the kind of exchange of capital, whether it's cultural capital or other things that were built up by people who stayed. So there is certainly an effect of reestablishing yourself when you make an act of mobility. So those are going to have costs. And I think you heard from Dan Larimore earlier, and he's looked at institutional mobility networks. And certainly if you're moving to institutions of higher reputation or prestige, that has a benefit for you. But if your mobility patterns move you to lower institutions, that has a cost. So mobility is not universally a good thing. It depends to which countries you're moving, to which institutions you're moving, and how frequently you're moving, and the degree to which you're maintaining ties with your last networks.
Thank you.
Great. I think we can continue the discussion on Slack, and just thank you so much. This is such a wonderful talk, and I think a really great final mentor lecture of Canoe for us to sort of leave and think about how we do our own science. So thank you so much. Always a pleasure, Cassidy.
Thanks, Jennifer.
All right, we'll be spending the rest of the day on projects, so get to work. I'll see you guys later. All right. Bye.
Bye, Jennifer.